The Trail of Tears by Weiwei Chen. The Trail of Tears was spurred into action with the signing of the Indian Removal Act, while the Cherokee signed the Treaty of New Echota. By 1835, all tribes of the 5 civilized tribes signed the acts, giving the government the power to relocate our Native Americans. This tragic act killed more than 4,000. Since the very beginning, white settlers have been treating the Native Americans as aliens and regarding them as strange and mysterious. Countless wars have been fought over Indian land. Over a period of time, some government officials, including George Washington, suggested that they were to be civilized and were taught English. Some were even encouraged to convert to Christianity. The tribes that followed these English customs were nicknamed the 5 civilized tribes and maintained good relationships with the white colonists. The 5 civilized tribes consisted of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee or the Creek, and the Seminole. Their land has been the main interest of those who planted crops. In addition to being quite fertile, the land could be used to further colonize the area. The settlers had no right to the natives' land, but, according to History.com, they often stole livestock and burned and looted towns. Andrew Jackson, the president at the time, was a big supporter of moving the Native Americans out west, even though he received support during the Battle of Horseshoe Bend from the Cherokee Indians. Before he became president, he was a general in the U.S. Army, where he, quote, had spent years leading brutal campaigns against the Creeks in Georgia and Alabama and the Seminoles in Florida, unquote, along with other experiences with the Native Americans. Georgia tried to evict the Cherokee nations, but the Cherokee sent their men to the Supreme Court to argue the decision. John Marshall, the judge serving at the U.S. Supreme Court, ruled that the Cherokee were a sovereign nation, and as a result, the state government's laws had no effect. Furious with the ruling, Andrew Jackson remarked, quote, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Over the 5 years following the signing of the Indian Removal Act, an act that allowed the government to relocate the Native Americans, almost all of the tribes had given in. At first, all the tribes oppressed the act, and the Cherokee used their newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, as a place to express their thoughts and ideas. The act was greeted with enthusiasm from the white settlers and state governments, pleased that they had a way to take back their land. By 1834, only the Cherokee had not agreed. Their tribe was split between, quote, a national party, opposed to removal, and a treaty party, in favor of it. On December 29, 1835, John Ridge, his father Major Ridge, and others who supported moving west went and signed the Treaty of New Echota without the permission of John Ross, the tribe chief. Though many others signed a protest stating that John Ridge and Major Ridge had no authority to make decisions, the treaty was ratified and put into action. They were given 2 years to make up their decision to leave willingly, but the majority of the Cherokee refused to leave until forced removal was carried out in 1838 with the militia to escort them. However, before they could begin, they all were relocated into stockade camps and forts. These were created for the Native Americans to round them up, and the earliest of them were built after the signing of the Indian Removal Act. The colonists teased the Native Americans, saying that the forts would be their new homes. Later on, this would prove true, even when, in concern, important members of the Cherokee Indians spoke to Andrew Jackson, who in turn said, quote, "You shall remain in your ancient land as long as grass grows and water runs." When they were called to the stockades, many of them barely had time to grab a few of their belongings. More weren't even allowed to. Quote, "Some of the Cherokee reported to the forts, not knowing the fate that awaited them, simply because John Ross had told them this is what they should do." According to About North Georgia, quote, "Conditions at the forts were horrible. Food intended for the tribe was sold to locals. What little the Cherokee had brought with them was stolen and sold. Living areas were filled with excrement." The majority of the Cherokee had to stay at these forts for 4 to 5 months before leaving to the Trail of Tears. Many of the deaths, including in the 4,000 fatalities, were from the poor living conditions. Someone who worked at the stockades wrote, quote, "During the Civil War, I watched as hundreds of men died, including my own brother, but none of that compares to what we did to the Cherokee Indians." The prospect of having more land, the state of Georgia started holding lotteries, with the winners having chunks of the Cherokee land. All the tribes of the 5 civilized tribes walked the trail that passed through 9 states and had many different paths, consisting of multiple land routes and one water route. They often walked at gunpoint, with the military herding them along. The trail stretched 5,045 miles, or 8,120 kilometers. Over 4,000 died during the journey due to the cold, cholera, death from starvation, exhaustion, and deficient reserves of food and other items. In the end, they ended in Oklahoma, where they were to live their new lives. Upon arrival, John Ridge, Major Ridge, and Elias Boudinot of the Cherokee tribe were all murdered by a group of Native Americans who did not support the forced relocation. Over time, they settled down, and many stories and personal accounts were shared. As John G. Burnett put it, "One can never forget the sadness and solemnity of that morning. Chief John Ross led in prayer, and when the bugle sounded and the wagon started rolling, many of the children rose to their feet and waved their little hands goodbye to their mountain homes, knowing that they were leaving them forever. Many of these helpless people did not have blankets, and many of them had been driven from the home barefooted." John describes the horror and the tragedy that the Native Americans faced during the duration of the Trail of Tears, when he was only a private in the military. Later on, several monuments called End of the Trail were created, monumenting the termination of the Trail of Tears. This sculpture was created by James Earl Fraser and was duplicated in multiple different materials, spread across America. The trail is now marked as a historical trail, and with monuments like End of the Trail and the preserved memories of those who survived it, it should never be forgotten. The Trail of Tears was a tragic phase in history, marked with the signing of the Indian Removal Act and the 4,000 casualties suffered from the 5 civilized tribes.